The Silent War, humanity's greatest secret, a strange peace. They say the world has never been quieter. No great wars, no loud revolutions, no cities falling, no sirens wailing. Just peace, a silence that stretches across the continents. Comforting, still, but not everyone trusts the quiet. There are whispers, stories told in hushed tones on porches, between old friends over coffee, or inside long-forgotten government buildings. Stories of strange lights that never made the news, of meetings that didn't appear on any calendar, of a war not fought with guns or tanks, but with secrets and silence. You won't find it in the history books, not in any classroom. Even the people who lived through it barely remember. Or maybe they were made to forget. They say it began over 100 years ago. Some say longer. A conflict so large it couldn't be seen, so quiet it couldn't be heard. But it was real. You'd never guess that humanity once stood at the edge of something vast. Not with the way the birds still sing in the morning. Not with the way children still laugh on sidewalks. Not with the way the moon still hangs in the sky. So peaceful, so distant. And yet something happened. It began not with an explosion, but with a sound no human could hear. A message not meant for ears, but for minds. A silent signal, from far away, from them. We didn't know who they were, or what they wanted. We only knew they had found us. And so began the war no one saw. No battlefields, no uniforms, just a slow, quiet dance between two species, both trying to understand the other, or outlast them. This is the story of that war. The war you were never told about. The war that shaped everything. The Silent War. And perhaps humanity's greatest secret. Whispers in the static. It started in a cold room, buried beneath an old mountain in northern Canada. Not many people knew it existed. Even fewer were allowed inside. There, behind thick concrete walls and heavy steel doors, sat a man named Edward Lang. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a scientist. He was a radio operator, retired twice, brought back quietly. Not because he was special, but because he was patient. He had a room filled with dials, switches, and blinking lights. Old equipment, patched together over the years. It hummed and clicked like it had a mind of its own. Most of the time, it only caught echoes, static from distant stars, forgotten satellites, and the empty rhythm of the cosmos. Edward listened every day, 12 hours, sometimes more. He brought a thermos of tea, a pack of biscuits, and a small, leather-bound notebook. For years, there was nothing, only the steady, familiar silence. But then, one morning, just past 3:30, something changed. It wasn't a sound, not in the way we know sound. It was a pattern hidden inside the static. Too clean, too perfect. It didn't belong. Edward sat up straight. The hairs on his arms rose. He scribbled into his notebook without looking down. Dots, pauses, repeats. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it wasn't natural, and it wasn't human. He didn't tell anyone, not right away. He listened again the next night, and the next. Each time, the signal returned. A low humming beat, like a voice with no mouth, whispering through the darkness of space. He reported it to his supervisor. The call didn't last long. 3 minutes, maybe less. The next day, strangers arrived. No uniforms, no names. They took Edward's notes. They asked no questions. They gave no answers. And then they left. But the signal didn't. Far across the ocean, in an old listening post deep in the Carpathian Mountains. Another operator, Irina Markov, heard the same thing. She described it as a pulse, a thought that wasn't hers, pressed into her mind like a cold breath on glass. All across the world, quietly, these signals were being heard. In deserts, on ships, beneath cities, but only by a few, only by those listening. Each heard the same pattern. Each one described the same feeling. Not fear, but a strange kind of recognition, as if something or someone was saying, "I see you." But what did it mean? Was it a threat? A greeting? A warning? No one knew. And yet, even then, humanity did not panic. We didn't shout into the stars. We didn't fire rockets or scramble armies. We did something different. We listened, and we waited. Because deep down, we knew this wasn't the beginning of contact. It was the beginning of something else. Something slower. Something quieter. Something we were not prepared for. The first move in a game. Played in silence. The hidden war rooms. They were not marked on any maps. There were no signs above their doors. No flags. No ceremonies. Just heavy locks and silence. Beneath mountains. Under lakes. Inside the deepest parts of old government buildings. They gathered. Not soldiers. Not generals. But watchers. People who knew things others didn't. Historians who studied events that never happened. Linguists who decoded languages no one spoke. Mathematicians who mapped stars without names. These were the rooms where the quiet war began. The lights inside were always dim. The clocks had no numbers. Some rooms had no windows. And others had no floors, just glass. Looking down into strange machines that pulsed softly in the dark. They didn't talk much. When they did, it was in careful tones. Words chosen like chess pieces. Voices kept low, even when alone. Because what they were working on was not a weapon. Not in the way we usually think. It was a question. One that had no clear answer. Not yet. What did they want? That was it. For words. Every folder, every note, every long hour spent hunched over a desk was wrapped around that question. The signals, the pulses, they kept coming. They were never exactly the same, but always close, always familiar. At first, we tried to answer. Quietly, gently. A reply sent not through radio, but through pattern, rhythm, shape, emotion. We used machines that could dream, programs that could feel, voices built from memory and light. And the answers came back. Strange, confusing, but unmistakably aware. They were listening too. The hidden rooms filled with silent excitement. No cheers, no applause, just long, deep breaths, and more questions. They called it the mirror protocol, not because it reflected light, but because it reflected us. Each time we sent something, the reply came back twisted, changed, like holding up a mirror and seeing a version of yourself, but not quite human. They were learning, and so were we. Over time, the language changed, not with words, but with feelings. A pulse that made you feel calm. A sequence that stirred old memories. A pause that brought sadness. Like a song without lyrics. No one trained for this. No military academy taught this kind of war. It didn't need guns. It needed understanding. And patience. Years passed. The rooms stayed hidden. People came and went. But the silence remained. Except it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of meaning. Heavy with invisible weight. The watchers knew. Something was building. Not a threat. Not exactly. But a presence. The kind that watches you sleep. The kind that stands just beyond the light. Waiting. Not to strike. But to decide. And we had no idea what choice they were making. The quiet visitors. They never landed. No roaring engines. No flashing lights in the sky. No speeches. No meetings on tarmacs. They didn't come the way we imagined they would. But they came. At first, it was only a feeling. In the cold forests of Finland, an old woman paused while gathering firewood. She said the trees went still. Even the wind stopped. And for just a moment, she felt like she was being watched. From inside her own mind. In the red deserts of Australia, a young boy saw shadows that didn't belong. They moved without sound. Slow. Curious. And then they vanished like breath in the heat. In a lighthouse on the coast of Japan, a keeper awoke in the middle of the night, with no memory of rising. Yet his logbook had been written in a single line. We are still learning. None of these stories made the news. They were passed from person to person, quietly, like folded notes in a crowded room. The visitors never stayed, but they never left either. They would appear in places far from cities, places forgotten by most, places where time moved slowly. And always the same feeling remained. Not fear, but curiosity, like a question being asked, but never spoken. No one saw their faces. At least, no one could describe them. When asked, witnesses would frown, as if trying to remember a dream already fading. Some said the visitors looked like people. Others said they looked like shadows, wrapped in light. One man, an old park ranger in Colorado, described them as the shape of a thought. He couldn't explain what he meant. He just knew it made sense. The quiet war was changing. It wasn't just signals anymore. It wasn't just hidden rooms and old machines. Now, they were here, among us. And they weren't attacking. They weren't helping either. They were simply observing. In the months that followed, plants began to grow differently in certain regions. Not larger, not faster, just strange. Vines curling in spiral patterns, leaves that folded inward during the day, trees whose bark held tiny geometric shapes that seemed too precise to be natural. Animals began behaving oddly too. Birds flew in unfamiliar formations. Whales gathered in places they hadn't visited in centuries. Dogs stared at empty corners of the room, ears tilted, waiting for something their owners couldn't hear. The watchers in the hidden war rooms took notice. Charts were filled, patterns were recorded, but no conclusions came. Only one word kept appearing in the logs. Listening, as if the world itself had become an ear, tuned to a frequency no human could hear. And still, no answers, just a growing sense that someone, something, was trying to understand us. From the inside out, not through violence, not through conquest, through presence, through patience, through silence. The agreement that never happened. There are vaults beneath certain cities. Not banks, not libraries. Vaults built for something else. For silence. Inside them are documents without titles. Typed pages without authors. Signed by no hand. Stamped with no seal. Yet they exist. Tucked away behind layers of concrete and steel. Unread. Unspoken. But never destroyed. Some are written in strange symbols. Some in perfect English. Some in languages no one remembers teaching. They tell of meetings. Not the kind with suits and ties. Not the kind with flashing cameras or long speeches. These meetings happen in places that don't appear on satellite maps. Old mines, desert plateaus, frozen stretches of tundra. Witnesses, what few there were, don't remember much. Not the faces, not the voices, only the stillness. Like the world held its breath, while something ancient walked past. These were not negotiations, not in the way we understand them. There were no offers, no demands, only presence, only observation, and, in some strange, quiet way, an understanding. The documents describe an accord, but they never say what it was about, only that both sides agreed, not through words, but through silence, a shared stillness, like two minds holding the same thought. No signatures, no recordings, no proof, just a feeling, a ripple that moved outward across governments, across agencies, across entire generations. People began to disappear from public records. Not vanished, just removed, shifted into jobs with no descriptions, placed in houses with no addresses, living lives on the edge of memory, caretakers of something unspoken. They didn't carry weapons. They didn't wear uniforms. They carried silence. They wore ordinary faces. They worked as gardeners, librarians, bus drivers. And every now and then, they would pause, look at the sky, and remember something. They were never told. The agreement, if it can be called that, was not made to protect us or to warn us. It wasn't even made for us. It was made because we had been noticed, not as enemies, not as allies, but as something new. And the visitors, they had rules, old ones, rules about interference, rules about influence, rules about contact. We didn't break those rules, but we bent them by being curious, by listening back. And so, in the shadows of history, a line was drawn, one we cannot see, one we were never allowed to cross, unless invited, and humanity was still waiting for that invitation. Or perhaps we had already received it and simply didn't know how to read it. The generations that guarded the silence, they were never called heroes, never awarded medals. Their names were never etched into stone, but they were chosen, not for their strength, not for their knowledge, but for something harder to define, a quiet kind of knowing, a patience, a stillness in the soul. They came from all walks of life. A fisherman in Nova Scotia, a schoolteacher in rural India, a grandmother in a South African village, a monk who never spoke again after a certain summer. None of them were told what they were protecting, only that they must protect something. Something invisible, something sacred. Each was visited once, briefly, a moment that seemed ordinary at the time. A stranger asking for directions, a traveler stopping for water, a child lost in the woods who was never found again. The encounter would pass like a shadow at dusk. But afterward, they knew. Somehow, they knew, not with certainty, but with purpose. And from that moment forward, they lived differently. They noticed things others didn't. Patterns in leaves, changes in bird songs, voices in crowds that didn't belong to any face. They weren't trained to fight. They weren't asked to speak. They were asked to watch and to wait. One family in France passed down a small, smooth stone. It had no markings, no weight, but holding it gave the feeling of being watched and protected. A farmer in Argentina kept a map of stars. He claimed never to have seen, but somehow knew were real. He added new every winter. Never explained why. In Egypt, a quiet man swept the same steps, outside an old temple for 73 years. He once told a tourist, "They aren't gods. They're guests." Then he said nothing else for the rest of his life. These were not guardians in the traditional sense. They had no weapons, no commands, only silence and memory. They kept the truth alive, not by telling it, but by living with it, by passing down stories hidden in bedtime tales, gestures handed from grandparent to child, words spoken with meaning too deep for language. The watchers in the hidden war rooms had names for these people: silent bearers, echo holders, bridges, but the bearers never knew those names. They didn't need to. They only knew their role: to hold the line, not against invasion, but against forgetfulness, to carry a truth too heavy for the world to know all at once, a truth that was still unfolding. And so they waited, through wars, through peace, through lifetimes. They waited because they believed, not in fear, not in power, but in connection, even if it never came, even if the silence lasted forever. A farmhouse in Wyoming. The house sat alone, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by yellow fields, swaying gently under an endless sky. The kind of place where time moves slower, where the past never quite let go. The man who lived there was named Harold, 72 years old, widowed, wore the same worn boots every day, fed his chickens before the sun came up, read the paper at exactly 6:45, and never locked his doors. People in town said he was kind, but quiet, kept to himself. They also said he'd been there forever. No one remembered when he moved in, not even Harold. He didn't have much, just an old radio that didn't work, a tractor that coughed like it had a cold, and a barn that hadn't seen hay in 30 years. But the barn was where it started. It was during the storm, not the usual kind. No lightning, no thunder, just a heavy sky and a strange, humming wind. Harold had woken in the middle of the night, not from sound, but from a feeling. Something was outside. He walked to the window, half expecting coyotes, but what he saw instead was light, not bright, soft, like moonlight reflected on water. But it pulsed slowly, as if breathing. It came from the barn. Harold didn't panic, didn't grab a rifle, didn't call anyone. He just pulled on his boots, wrapped a coat around his shoulders, and stepped into the night. The grass was damp, the wind warm, and the closer he got, the more everything felt still, not dead, not asleep, just waiting. He opened the barn door, and the light vanished. Inside there was nothing, no footprints, no burnt marks, no broken wood, just the smell of old hay and the quiet creak of the roof. But Harold felt something, not fear, not confusion, a kind of recognition, like something long forgotten, had returned. He didn't tell anyone, not the postman, not the sheriff, not even the pastor who stopped by once a month. But he began to remember things, small details. A melody he hadn't heard since childhood suddenly whistled through the trees. A drawing he'd once made at 7 years old, now tucked inside the back of an old book. Except he didn't own the book. And dreams, strange ones, standing in fields under unfamiliar stars. Voices speaking without words. Hands reaching out, not to take, but to understand. Harold started keeping a notebook. one his wife had left behind. He filled it slowly, not with explanations, but with feelings. It's not here to hurt us. It doesn't understand sadness, but it's trying. The barn is listening. He didn't know who would ever read it. He just knew he had to write. One morning, he found a stone on his porch. Smooth, warm, the same color as the sky before rain. He held it for hours, then placed it on his windowsill. After that, the barn stayed quiet. The light never returned. But Harold, he kept listening. He sat on his porch each evening, watching the fields, not waiting for something to come, just making himself available. Because somewhere deep inside, he knew he had always been part of this, long before he remembered, long before he was even born. And in his silence, in his patience, he was still playing his part. The language without sound. Language is a strange thing. We think of it as words, spoken, written, heard. But that's only a small part. Before we learn to speak, we learn to feel, to sense a tone, to understand a look, to feel what isn't said. The visitors, they never used words. They had something else. A language made of pauses, of patterns, of presence. It couldn't be taught. Not the way we teach alphabets. It had to be experienced. At first, it drove people mad. Not violently, not loudly, just slowly, a soft unraveling, as if their thoughts no longer fit the shape of their minds. Some described it as music they couldn't hear, but somehow remembered. Others called it a weight in the chest. Not heavy, just constant. But for a few, a quiet few, it made sense. They couldn't explain why. They just knew what was being said. Not in words, not even in pictures, in feelings, in colors that didn't exist, in emotions that had no name. One woman in Iceland, a linguist, sat in silence for 8 days straight. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. She said, "They speak in thresholds, in the space between." When asked what that meant, she smiled and never spoke again. In a monastery in Tibet, monks began arranging stones in spiral patterns. Not for decoration, not for art, just because it felt right. They said nothing. They just listened. The watchers noticed. In the hidden war rooms, charts changed, not tracking threats anymore, but feelings, moments, unexplained events. A tree blooming out of season, an infant laughing at nothing for hours. A man in Brazil painting stars he'd never seen, only to match a formation discovered weeks later. Something was shifting, and humanity, slowly, quietly, was learning to understand. The visitors never forced it. They never pushed. They simply offered the shape of something greater and waited to see if we would notice. Some did. Not the loudest among us, not the powerful, but those who knew how to be still. A violin maker in Italy who stopped using strings and built instruments that made no sound, yet moved people to tears. A child in Kenya who drew circles for days, each one more perfect than the last, until they became something else. A message, not meant to be read, but felt. Across the world, the silent language spread, not through technology, not through systems, but through people, people who had never met, yet shared the same dreams, the same gentle sense that something was unfolding, something not meant to be conquered, only understood. We began to speak back, not in our usual way, not with declarations or speeches, but through action, through presence. A community planting trees in patterns they couldn't explain, a stranger stopping to help an old man across a street, and both walking away with tears in their eyes, not knowing why. Small things, gentle things, but they mattered, because every silent word, every pause filled with meaning, every shared moment of stillness was a reply. And in that slow, delicate conversation, humanity began to change. Not loudly, not suddenly, but deeply. The language had no name, no structure, no rules, but it was there, between heartbeats, between thoughts, between us. The true battlefield. It was never about land, not about power, not about control. This war, if it could even be called that, was not fought with soldiers or ships, not in space, not in skies. It was fought in silence, in the quiet spaces of the mind, in the unlit corners of memory. It was a war of endurance, of patience, of understanding who could remain, without needing to win. The visitors did not come with destruction. They came with questions, unspoken, unfinished, and humanity answered with wonder. But the battle was still real, because silence can be heavy. It can wear down even the strongest. It asks for stillness when the world wants noise. It asks for presence when the world wants escape. And not everyone could bear it. Some governments tried to bury it, not because they were evil, but because they were afraid. Afraid of a war they couldn't see. Afraid of an enemy that wasn't an enemy. Afraid of what it might mean to admit. We are not alone, and never have been. They built walls of denial, quiet programs to silence those who knew too much, not through violence, but through redirection, a job change, a forgotten assignment, a transfer to someplace far, someplace still. Yet even behind those walls, the silence found its way in glances exchanged between strangers on trains, in the sudden hush of a crowded room, in the sense that something just beyond understanding was watching, waiting, wondering. The true battlefield was not outside us. It was within. Our fear of the unknown, our desire for control, our endless need to speak, even when we have nothing to say. The visitors never forced us to change. They simply showed us something deeper, a kind of reflection, not of what we are, but what we could become. Some fought it, denied it, called it fantasy, madness, nonsense. Others welcomed it, not with words, but with openness, with attention, with stillness. The war, if it was a war, was not about domination. It was about readiness. Were we ready to listen without needing answers? Were we ready to grow without knowing the outcome? Were we ready to see ourselves through eyes not our own? There were no victories, no parades, no defeats, just moments, scattered across time. A woman waking in the middle of the night, with tears in her eyes, and no memory of why. A man planting a tree, in the same place his father did, without ever being told. A child humming a tune. Then no one taught them, but everyone somehow remembered. These were the battles. These were the quiet triumphs. No flags, no headlines, just echoes of something larger, gentler, wiser. The war was still going on, but not in violence, not in conquest, in patience, in listening, in the spaces between. The silence grows louder. It wasn't that things stopped. It was that they slowed. The signals came less often. The strange visitors stopped appearing altogether. The barn lights, the spiraled stones, the unspoken feelings faded, but the silence didn't go away. It deepened. People began to notice, not events, but absences, the kind of quiet that presses against your skin, like standing in a church after everyone has left. A stillness filled with something you can't quite name. Across the world, those who had once listened felt its weight. The watchers in the hidden rooms stayed at their posts, but their reports grew thinner. The patterns slowed. The signals became quieter, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. And humanity began to wonder, was it over? Had they given up on us? Had we failed some unseen test? Or had we passed it? No one knew, but the silence lingered. It was not empty. In remote villages and quiet corners of cities, people reported strange dreams. Not frightening, but vivid. They described walking through vast halls of light, standing before shapes that shifted with thought, holding conversations without speaking. And always, upon waking, a single feeling remained. Something had changed. Not outside, inside. In an observatory in South Africa, a technician found that the stars no longer matched their charts. Not because the stars had moved, but because the charts had. Somehow subtly, our own maps of the sky had shifted, corrected themselves. No one could explain it. In a nursing home in Sweden, an old man began drawing intricate symbols into the air. He had Alzheimer's. He hadn't spoken in years, but his fingers moved with purpose. Every day, the same shapes, again and again. No one understood what they meant, but the nurses said it was beautiful. It was as if the silence itself had begun to speak. Not in noise, not in light, but in change, in the gentle rearrangement of the world. Doors left slightly open. Books turned to different pages, time seeming to stretch in quiet moments, as though the seconds were giving us space to feel. The bearers, the ones who had carried the memory, felt it first. They began passing on their roles, not with ceremony, but with quiet conversations, a touch on the shoulder, a story told just once, and always the same final words. You'll know what to do, because something was coming, not in the form of ships, not in the form of threats, but in the form of a message. The final one, perhaps, the one that would not ask for anything, the one that would not wait for an answer, the one that would simply be, and already, the silence was bending around it, growing louder, more present, as if the universe was leaning in. The signal that changed everything. It arrived on a morning like any other. No storms, no signs. The sky was clear. The world moved on, unaware. But far below that world, beneath a mountain, inside one of the oldest listening stations still active, a man named Simon heard it. He was not expecting anything. The boards had been quiet for weeks. The usual static, the usual nothing. But then, there it was. Not a pulse, not a pattern, not even a sound. It was something else. A feeling so strong, so sudden, that Simon dropped his coffee before he even understood why. His mind didn't register fear or confusion, only one word. Now. It came with no explanation, no translation, but it was clear, and Simon was not the only one who felt it. Across the globe at the same moment, others felt it too. A child in Turkey stopped playing and looked at the sky. A woman in a train station in Poland gasped and couldn't say why. A man walking his dog in rural Nebraska stood still, tears in his eyes, his heart pounding with something that felt like relief. They all heard the same thing, though there was no sound. It wasn't just a message. It was a moment, shared across continents, across lives, like every mind on Earth had been tapped gently on the shoulder by something vast and kind and waiting in the hidden war rooms. The lights blinked once, then held steady. No alerts, no alarms, just a quiet hum, as if all the systems finally agreed. The watchers didn't speak. It didn't need to. The silence in the room was now full of meaning. The bearers, scattered across the world, felt it too. Some fell to their knees. Some smiled softly. Some simply sat down and closed their eyes. Not because it was over, but because something had arrived, and it didn't need to knock. What followed was not dramatic. There were no sudden changes in the sky, no great flashes, no turning of the tide, but something in the air felt different, as if the world had taken a breath it didn't know it was holding. Machines hummed in strange harmony. Animals moved with a new rhythm. The wind carried a note, not a song, but the memory of one. The message, if it could be called that, was never written down. It couldn't be recorded. It couldn't be replayed. It could only be felt. And what it said was not a threat, not an instruction, not even a greeting. It said, "You are ready." Nothing more, nothing less. The watchers stood from their chairs, not in alarm, but with quiet awe. They knew their part was finished. The hidden rooms would empty. The machines would sleep. The silence had spoken, and humanity had listened. Somewhere, far beyond the stars, something turned, not toward us, but with us. And the war that was never loud, never seen, never truly understood, had shifted, not ended, not begun, just shifted, as if a new page had turned, in a book we hadn't realized we were writing. Together,